All right, Gaurav, why don't we go ahead and get started? Thank you, everyone, for coming to another Reltio community show. I'm Chris Detzel, and today we have, I don't know if he's a special guest because he's been on several times in the past, but Gaurav Gera. He's a principal product manager here at Reltio. Gaurav, how are you?
Good. Thanks. Nice to be here.
Yeah, good to see you again. I'm excited about this one. So the topic is Reltio Integration Hub, tasks and best practices to optimize task utilization. So hopefully that's what you're thinking about. So rules of the show: keep yourself on mute. Questions should be asked in chat. I'll make sure to get to them, and or you can take yourself off mute. We do that from time to time. The show will be recorded and posted to the community, and I will follow up as I usually do. We have a few upcoming events. One is today's show. And as a matter of fact, Wednesday, we have another show coming up on patient centricity. If you're a life sciences company, I'm sure you'll be very interested in this show. We have Extria. They're one of our partners to bring some thought leadership around that area. On July 9th, we have a show around unlocking the potential of Reltio Business Critical Edition, enhanced security and resilience. And unfortunately, on July 11th, Reltio Pipeline for Databricks data pipeline for Databricks, we're going to have to reschedule, but just left that on there. We're still going to do it, but I'm just having to reschedule that for later July is my hope. We are still going to have July 18th on improved data discovery with Reltio Integration Hub for Calibra. So a lot of really good stuff here. We have a couple more that I just haven't put on this yet. We'll probably skip most of August and maybe look at late August into September to do those shows. And lastly, if you haven't signed up for the Data-Driven 2024 conference, register now. As a matter of fact, right here, you can get $200 off if you use community, and that has to be capitalized. So make sure you sign up for that. And I can provide the link in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing, Gaurav, and let you.
It's Chris. Hi, everyone. Gaurav Gera here. I'm part of the product management team here at Reltio. Really excited to be sharing best practices on the Reltio Integration Hub tasks. This has been a very common ask from all our customers as well as partners, and it's been a while that that we share this information, and it's on me that I'm sharing it so late, but better late than never. So there are a few topics that I'm going to cover in this, but feel free to stop me, ask for questions in chat. Chris can interrupt me and ask those on your behalf. I'll be happy to answer that. But here's the agenda. I'll give you a brief introduction of Reltio Integration Hub. If you have not encountered this capability as part of Reltio, this is a chance for you to learn more about it. Then we are going to jump into the details of what the tasks are, how it's calculated, why is it important to optimize those tasks, because it obviously links to money. And then finally, how you can monitor the tasks, and if there are any best practices on building recipes, then we'll cover those as well. Jumping right in, Reltio Integration Hub, this product has been out there for 3 years now, little over 3 years, and the whole purpose of having this product is for you to build your integrations, either to bring data into Reltio or consume data from Reltio into downstream systems in an easy, scalable, secured manner. And to be able to do that, we provide over 1,000 pre-built connectors. Now, these could be platform connectors or community connectors, along with a low-code, no-code, or user experience for you to build these recipes, as we call it. But these are typically the integration flows or data workflows for you to move data from one system to another system. It has all those rich capabilities around transforming data, validating the data, and then if you need to have alerts and monitoring requirements, this is a platform that provides all those capabilities, right? And the whole purpose over here is to expand the reach of the trusted data that Reltio curates for you. Make sure that all your systems, whether it's analytical systems or operational systems, they have the accurate, trusted data that you mentioned right out of Reltio. And since it's a platform wherein citizen developers can build out the integrations for you, It increases that business agility because now your data engineers don't have to work with IT teams. They can consume the data on their own. But just a correction over here, Reltio Integration Hub off late is not part of a base subscription. Earlier it was. If you have subscriptions of Reltio before of April 2024, Reltio Integration Hub would have been part of the platform itself. But since April 2024, Reltio Integration Hub is not a part of the subscriptions, right? We can talk about that if there are any specific questions. Yeah, I talked about the features. So briefly, we can build your integration flows or orchestration capabilities and incorporate things like validation, data transformations, alerts as part of this orchestration. There are a bunch of pre-built connectors available, provide you low code, no code integration capabilities through that point and click user experience tool, and then the data at rest as well as that motion is completely encrypted. The platform is certified with SOC 1, SOC 2, and the other security, compliance, and regulations. The core concept, and I'll come to the other concepts as well. The core piece that any data engineer or mostly data engineer would build is something called as a recipe. You may call it as an integration flow. You may call it as a data work. Within the tool, we call it as recipes. Now, these are recipes on the right-hand side. In screenshot, you can see a sample recipe. These recipes have something called as a trigger, which basically means how you want to initiate that recipe, whether it's based on an event, trigger, on a schedule, and whether it processes like bulk data or in a batch. There are powerful capabilities available on how you can build the business logic, or you can connect to either on-prem systems, cloud applications. It has also a connector SDK, so for connectors or for applications for which you do not find connectors within RIH, there is an SDK available for you to build that capability on your own. And then, as I mentioned, there are multiple connectors already out just before you decide to build your own connector. You may as well go and look for those platform or even community built connector. Right? These recipes can be, if you have started working on providing pre-built recipes as well, so you would learn a lot more about these coming out, for example, with our D&B data blocks integration, Reltio integration for Calibra. These are all based on these recipes, and we now provide it on top of Reltio Integration Hub. But some of the core concepts that you need to understand before we go into the depths of tasks and how you optimize or build these recipes. The first one is the connector. Right? So the connector is nothing but a simple piece of code that allows you to connect Reltio or Reltio Integration Hub as an application to that source system or that downstream system. So think of Salesforce, think of Redshift, think of any database system, any cloud application, any on-prem application. You need to connect that system with Reltio, right? So that becomes a system-to-system connectivity. It provides you things like how you want to authenticate Reltio against that source system or that source system against Reltio. So whether you're using OAuth-based authentication or you're busy using client-based authentication or some other basic authentication. So it provides you how you can connect, how you can provide your authentication. And lastly, it also provides you what all kind of actions that you can consume on those sources. For example, if you're connecting to Reltio, in Reltio, we have exposed certain set of APIs. So Reltio is built on thousands of or hundreds of APIs, and not all those APIs are available through the connector. Only the most commonly used APIs that you need for you to bring data into Reltio, consume data out of Reltio, are provided as part of the Reltio connector, right? So all those APIs are exposed in the form of action. So whether it's get entity, search entity, or post entities, get match results, things like that, right? So all these kind of APIs are exposed as part of actions through the connector. So I hope you understand what the connector actually does. It provides technical connectivity, it provides how you authenticate, and it provides that basic list of actions that you can perform on top of those downstream systems. Then there is this piece called recipe. I explained in the earlier slide as well. Recipe is nothing but that workflow or the integration flow that orchestrates the data movement from your source system to the downstream systems, Reltio being one of these. So Reltio needs to be either a source or a downstream system in case you're using Reltio Integration Hub. Then the other piece is job, right? I'll come to task a bit later. So the job is nothing but the actual run or the execution of the recipes, right? So think of recipes as the design time artifact which you are building to connect Reltio to, let's say, Salesforce system or a HubSpot system, right? Once you have designed how you want to pick up data from Reltio, how you want to transform that data, what kind of validations you want to perform, and how you want to push that data into a Hub. So that becomes a recipe. Job is nothing but the runtime version of that recipe. And this recipe gets triggered, let's say on an event basis, a new record gets created in Reltio, it triggers this recipe, and that recipe then moves that data from Reltio to HubSpot, right? And that movement or that execution of data transfer happens through a job. So think of job as the runtime version of the recipe. It performs that actual data exchange from one system to another system. Right? And then there's this concept of task. Task is, don't think of task as in terms of an activity or an action that is performed. Task over here is a unit of measurement for the compute that gets consumed when a job is executed. There are multiple steps that execute within a job, and for those steps, there are tasks getting consumed. And so task is nothing but that unit of measure of the compute of that resource. Typically, when you buy Reltio Integration Hub, you get a certain entitlement of tasks that you are allowed to consume for, right? So if you were on a subscription plan earlier than April of 2024, you were allowed to use 25% of your consolidated profiles as the tasks on a monthly basis. For example, if you have 100,000 consolidated profiles that you have licensed for with Reltio as the base package, then on a monthly basis, you can consume up to 25,000 tasks. So that's the entitlement. Right? And you can then monitor how your recipes are executing and how much tasks are those are getting in. That's the basic definition of task and how it is being used. And often these questions come in during the sales cycle, or even customers, when they start working on recipes, they identify that their task utilization is too high. They don't understand what kind of calculations are being performed. Right? So I'm going to answer those questions over here in much detail. Okay. So before I jump into what is a task and how these are calculated, are there any questions around these core concepts of Reltio Integration?
There's one. Where can we check how many tasks are executing per month?
I will come to that. It's not a monthly basis. Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of a dashboard, but I can share the dashboard and it's part of the demo as to how many tasks are getting consumed, how many recipes that you have, how many jobs are getting consumed. So there is a demo specifically.
Perfect.
Okay. As I said, task is nothing but a unit of work, a unit of measurement of the compute resource that is being consumed in a recipe job execution. So not everything is a task. As you can see over here from this picture, a trigger, which is nothing but it's something that starts a recipe or starts a recipe job. That's not a task. If you're performing any kind of logic and the control statements within that logic, like the if condition, the repeat, the stop statement, or even the handle errors, which is nothing but your exception handling, all those kinds of steps within the recipe are also not considered as part of tasks. What are considered as part of the task is the actual action that is being performed, actual compute that is happening. So any action in the recipe that you perform. So for example, if you're calling an API or performing some sort of a compute. So for example, if you are writing a piece of code in Python or JavaScript, and for that you have defined a connector, right? Or you are, for example, declared variable for that. All those actions that you perform within the recipe, they become task. Anytime when you're defining this the recipe, you click on the action in app, make sure you need to, in the back of your mind, think that this will consume that one task. If you're calling another recipe from your main recipe, that also becomes a task. So I'll come to the examples in the next slide, but hopefully this kind of explains on a high level within a recipe what is a task or what sections in the recipe will be considered as part of the task and what steps are not part of the task. Here's that one simple example. So this is a simple recipe, and what you're looking at is a job execution. So a job has been completed for a particular recipe. This scheduled job, not an ideal recipe, not something that you would build, but think of this as a sample recipe, an example, so to speak, to understand how the tasks are calculated. It has a trigger. This trigger is a scheduled trigger which runs, let's say, at midnight, right, on a daily basis. And what it does is it reads some data from Reltio based on some ID, and then it replicates that data to HubSpot, and then it also updates that, for example, a crosswalk in Reltio, and then logs that message in a Workato log or a Reltio Integration Hub log. If this job is successfully executed and all these 4 steps are completed, right? In such cases, there will be 4 tasks in the 1, 2, 3, and 4. And within a job execution log, you can see that task is also given over here as to how many tasks were consumed as part of the job execution, right? And so this is a simple calculation over. Right? And this is for a successful job. If there is a job failure, so for example, if the job had failed at step 4, but step 2 and step 3 were successfully executed, even though job failed, still be 2 tasks consumed because these 2 steps were completely completed, but the job failed at step 4. So there will be no task for step 4, and there will be no task for step 5. So in a failed job, also the tasks are getting consumed based on the successful execution of those steps. So this is a simple example. This is more of a different version wherein I've introduced a simple if statement. Right now, here you can see that this recipe would either consume 1 task or 4 tasks, depending on the result of step number 3, which is an if condition. If the if condition is false, the rest of these steps within the if condition is not executed, only step 2 is executed, so that's why it's step. But if the if condition was true and the job executed step number 4, 5, and 6, then the task consumed would be 4. So depending on how your job executes, how your data is being processed within the recipe, the task consumption can vary, right? And so that's why it's important to identify or design your recipes in a way so that how many tasks are consumed, and you can estimate based on those use cases. Here's another example, right? And in this case, it uses a for loop as well as an if statement, right? Now, what this recipe is doing is it's getting triggered on a scheduled basis. It looks up for data in an Amazon SQS queue. It processes multiple messages. So it says new messages, so it can process multiple messages. And within a loop, it receives that one message, processes one message, it passes that message, checks if the event type from that message is entity underscore created. In that case, it will go and fetch the data for that organization, if it was an organization, and then pushes that data into Salesforce as an account. So a bit complex recipe, and it all depends on the number of messages that are being processed in one job execution that will determine the number of tasks are consumed. So let's assume that in this case, there were 5 messages in the queue, right? It would go into this for loop, pass all the 5 messages, right? And then it found that out of 5, only 1 message was entity underscore created event. So that's why for that 1 message, it processed the 2 additional steps of fetching the ID or the details based on the ID and the created that account in Salesforce, right? So that's why the total task consumption over here is 5 plus 2, 7. So that's why the total task is the number of messages multiplied by step 1 plus the number of messages multiplied by number 2 if step 4 is true. Right? So that's how tasks are calculated, and you can see that in the job log. And the reason we are doing this one message at a time over here is in the center section, you can see that this message, every message has its own structure. So it has attributes, body, and then some other parameters for that message. And what we are interested is only the body part. This is where the actual data resides within every message that gets generated in LTO and post out to queue, right? So this is the reason that we read every message and then pass it. So there's a better way to do that, wherein we can utilize the task, right? But so you can understand the downside over here. So let's say there were 1,000 messages in the queue, and this recipe was processing those 1,000 messages. Then it would have consumed at least 1,000 tasks, even if there were no actual processing happening. So let's say all those events for entity underscore change, then this would have paid all the time, right? And all those 1,000 tasks would have been consumed just for passing, and you would have run this entire recipe for nothing, right? But you still would have consumed up to 1,000 tasks. So highly inefficient recipe, and we'll come to that during the demo. So here is a bit optimized version of that recipe. What I've done over here is instead of processing the parsing as part of the loop itself, one message at a time, I put that logic in a Ruby script, for example, right? So the step number 2, the Ruby script does that parsing for the body of all the individual messages that we have, and it generates a list with just the list of entities that were put to this queue. And then I've added one more additional step over here to separate out the create versus the other events. And then I process only the create events, right? So in this case, let's assume that it was processing one task, or rather one message, then it would have consumed 3 tasks, right? But still, this is also working in back. If there were, let's say, 1,000 messages, it would, and all those 1,000 messages were changed events, not create events, then at max, only 2 tasks would have been consumed against 1,000 in the previous example of the recipe, right? So this improves the performance of the recipe as well as the utilization of the tasks. So yeah, these are a couple of examples of how the tasks are getting calculated in different scenarios. So the next thing that I want to do is the question that was asked around how do you monitor the risk. So for that, I'm going to jump onto Reltio Integration Hub, and you can launch Reltio Integration Hub either from the chocolate bar, as we call it. You can launch Integration Hub from here, or if you have a console application, within the console application, you will see an example, a link to launch the integration. Then when you do that, you land up on this page. So there's something called as dashboard. I'll come to some of the other pieces as well, recipes as well later on. But this is the dashboard, which is where you will be able to monitor the recipes that are getting executed, how many jobs are being executed, and how many tasks are being consumed. Right? So by default, it comes to, let's say, last 7 days. So within last 7 days, there have been 807 tasks that have been consumed. There were 53 failed jobs and 59 successful jobs out of 9 recipes. I can extend this to, let's say, last 30 days as well. And this is the graph that I get, 23,500 tasks getting consumed out of 155 successful plus 53 failed jobs. If I'm particularly interested on a particular day, for example, on this day of June 23rd, there were a lot high number of failed jobs. So I can just click on this. I can hover on this and see that there were 38 failed jobs, which is what I'm more interested in. And there were like 300 tasks used. So when you click on this, in the dashboard, you'll see that the filtered down list of all the recipes that were executed within that day of 23rd June. I can go a previous day and I can see the list of those tasks on or rather list of recipes that were executed the previous day. So this kind of also gives you that drill down version of at a recipe level, the number of jobs, the failed jobs, as well as the tasks that are getting consumed in those 24 hours, so to speak. Not just that, right? You can also monitor task consumption based on your projects as well. Let's say you were using the RIA Salesforce integration project, right? So in that case, you just select that project, and in the last 30 days, so the only day that was activated was on May 27th, and it had tasks and 8 jobs had existed. So this kind of also gives you a drill down version of at a project level or at a use case level how your recipes are performing. And then you can have other filters as well. So I can do, let's say, HubSpot. So how many recipes are there which are consuming or built with integration with HubSpot, and what's their task utilization, right? So I see that on June 19 and 20, there have been few cases wherein the integration with HubSpot has failed for whatever reason. Right? And then you can go and check the job details as to where these failed and what kind of improvements that you can do on top of these recipes. So hopefully this gives you a fair idea of how these uh, tasks are getting monitored and how we can do that. But one of the other pieces that important for everybody to understand is that if you go to job logs as well, and I've shown this screenshots earlier, you can see the tasks getting consumed in the individual jobs. So also,
Hey, Gaurav,
yeah.
quickly. So I assume tasks that ran successfully in the prod tenant are what will be counted and not the test dev tenant tasks.
So the entitlements are for your base package, right? So dev, test, and production. So all are counted against the entitlements, and that is one of the reasons that we are not able to show the dashboards that consolidated for the entire base package. Right? What over here is for your particular tenant only. So if you're in this particular tenant and the recipes are running in this tenant, then this will show the utilization in this tenant only. Right? When it comes to the consolidation piece, this is something that's been feedback that we have received more recently, and we are working with our processor, Workato, on how efficiently we can show that kind of a dashboard, which shows that aggregate view of task utilization across the base package, dev, test, and production, or the other tenants that you might have in your landscape.
What's the best way to restart from a failure point?
Good question. It's not from a failure point. So when you restart a job, it will pick up from the same trigger. So for example, I don't know, let's say this one. If I had to restart, so this kind of failed because the batch size was limited to 2000. If I have to start this job, it will pick up from this trigger itself, and it will start the entire execution from start, not just from step 6.
And one more question when we get to it. So would you recommend using RIH for daily batch jobs, or is it better to use some other mechanism using direct Reltio API calls?
Yeah, I'll come to that. I have an example, and you can see it also depends on what kind of use cases that you might have. But there are certain best practices that we follow, which is the whole purpose of the webinar. So I'll come to what are those best practices, and depending on the use cases, how you can define those cities.
Great. I have another question, but let's wait to ask that as we dive a little bit deeper in there.
Sure. Okay. Next piece is, now that you understand what task is, how to calculate the tasks, and why is it that we need to optimize our recipes? What does it make? Why are we telling you to do that? Well, first of all, it's important that your recipes run in an efficient manner. You get the kind of throughput that you expect within your recipes. Right? So if you have optimized your recipe, even if task optimization was your goal, you would have improved the performance, the throughput of those recipes as well. Because think of task is a way for you to, improve the performance of the recipe, right? That's the goal that we have. Task is just that stick for you to have that motivation, right? Efficient utilization of tasks. The mentioned task is an entitlement that you buy from Reltio, right? So you're basically paying for a task, even if it's on a $0 basis. Right. So that's why it's important that you consider task usage optimization. And lastly, since you're improving the performance, you are improving the task utilization, you're also saving the cost because the source systems that you would be integrating, those would also be applying some sort of credits, right? If you're purchasing API credits from your source systems or downstream systems, you would want to efficiently utilize those credits as well, because you're obviously, if you are able to do that efficient utilization, you'll be able to save costs. So this is the motivation for you to optimize these recipes, and given the different use cases that you might have, you can define your recipes to efficiently utilize tasks as well as get the performance that you might want to. So we're going to go through that same set of recipes that we went earlier uh, during the calculation of the task. So here's that same recipe once again with a higher number, reads that message from SQS, passes that message, checks what kind of event it was, whether it's a entity create, change, things like that, and then gets the data from Reltio using the Reltio ID, and then pushes that data to Salesforce. It's not a very efficient process. For example, if you are processing 10,000 create events, I'm just talking about create events, right? And if you're loading, for example, 10,000 records in Reltio, I'm sure there will be many events that will get generated. For example, if you are loading name and address, there will be relationship create events. Right? If you already have data within Reltio, then there will be some consolidation that happens. So there will be additional events for entity merge that might get triggered, right? So let's keep it simple. If we are creating 10,000 records in Reltio and it creates, let's say, even 10,000 events in the queue. In such cases, the recipe would consume 30,000 tasks based on the calculation that we just saw in the previous slide. And it has the potential of wasting a lot of tasks in case those events are not create events, right? So it's a very inefficient recipe. If there are no events in the recipe, still this recipe gets executed because it has a certain polling frequency, 5 minutes being minimum, and you can increase that polling frequency. So let's assume that you have put in polling of 30 minutes. Right? Every 30 minutes, it will go and check for new messages. If there are no messages, this recipe will still execute, although nothing will happen, but there will be still a job getting completed. No tasks will get consumed anyways because step 2 will not get executed. But still, you'll see a lot of blank jobs getting generated. And step number 4 is highly inefficient way of calling the API. Step number 5 and 6 will consume a lot of API credits as well as bring down the performance of this recipe. So even if you have to optimize this recipe a bit, the first thing that I will do is in step 1 in the trigger, I'll put in an object filter, which will check if that the job should start only if there are messages in the queue, right? Otherwise, just ignore, don't start the job. And since I'm processing multiple records, what I've done from the previous slide is here I was doing for each item in the message. So every message was getting processed. Now I'm doing a batch of messages. Right? Let's say this recipe was executing to 2,000 tasks, although it says 10K, a recipe would, in this case, process 2,000 tasks or read 2,000 messages from the SQS. I'm sorry, I did read 2,000 messages from the SQS, push down into this batch, and then run in a batch of whatever you have defined, let's say 200. So it will pick up those 200 messages, pass those messages in bulk, because as I explained earlier, I put this Ruby script that has this logic of looping through every message and then finding that event and the data. Fits that into different events like create and change, and then processes that. The other thing that I've changed over here from the previous recipe was I was creating here one account at a time. Here I'm creating account in batches. Then the batch definition depends on the source application that you are connecting to. So in this case, Salesforce allows for 200 accounts to be created in a batch at max. So yeah, that's why here in step 2, I had to do a batch size of 200. So in this case, for an event with 10,000 or for a queue of 10,000 events, there will be 5 jobs that will get executed because it will read 2,000 messages at a time. It will consume 30 tasks, um, which is much more efficient than the previous one. So earlier it was 30,000. We brought it down by a factor of 1,000. Uh, there will be no jobs that will get created. The data will be processed directly from the queue. So the other piece that we changed was, we were not processing the data from the queue. And one of the best practices that we tell from Reltio is always process the data from the queue itself instead of doing an additional get entity by ID from Reltio. So this is the other piece. We're processing the data from directly from the queue itself, and then the batch way of working, right? So since Salesforce allows 200 records, if you're connecting to HubSpot, they might have a different batch size. If you're loading data into Reltio, we have a batch size of 2,000. So you can load 2,000 records in a go in a single API call or a single action. The batch size would differ based on the source application that you are connecting it to. So this is another version of the same recipe with some task improvements. And there was a highly recipe with for performance as well as tasks. So for the same number of events, this would just consume 12 tasks per job. So bit better from 30 per job to 12 per job. There's only one wasted job over here. That is because I'm doing the parse and the split. So I've combined step 3 and 4 into one recipe to save that one task. So in this JavaScript itself, the parsing happens and the split happens, and then I check for those events and then process that in a batch of 200. So if you had, let's say, 10,000, 2,000 are being processed in one job, so 2,000, there will be one task consumed for parsing that, about 10 tasks within this loop to process or create accounts in matter of 12 of 2,000. So that's why 12 tasks are getting, right? Rest of the things are the same. You're processing the data directly from the queue as well as utilizing the batch APIs. So in summary, these are some of the best practices that you should follow based on what I just mentioned, right? So always use batch or bulk triggers. Right? Every connector that you connect to, so whether it's HQS, whether it's HubSpot, Salesforce, or any other source system, always use the batch or the bulk triggers to make sure that you are efficiently utilizing the number of events from that. So this is tip number 1. Tip number 2, always use a trigger condition, right? So if you are reading data in batches, you don't want to start those recipe jobs in case you get data which is not supposed to be processed by the recipe, right? So only if you have the data, for example, to be processed by the recipe, use these trigger conditions, right? And these are defined when you create the recipe, define a trigger. So for example, in this case, I'm processing the SQS messages only if the messages are available. Otherwise, the recipe will not start. The other piece of advice over here is, if possible, if your use cases permit you, increase the poll interval. If you're using, for example, the SQS queue or Azure PubSub or Azure queues or Azure topics, or Google PubSub, these allow you for a minimum poll frequency of 5 minutes, right? And with a maximum of, let's say, 1 hour or in days or on in weeks as well. Like, so if possible, make sure that if you're using SQS, you have an efficient way of defining the poll frequencies. It may happen that not every use case is a real-time use case, or not every use case is a near real-time use case. The data transfer can wait for an hour, for a day. In such cases, you can define your poll frequencies. And so this will also bring down the number of tasks that are getting consumed, as well as make sure that you are efficiently utilizing API calls, as well as you have a performant integration. Something else is similar to actions. Always use the bulk separate. With regard to triggers, always use batch and bulk action. Do not create, for example, one record at a time in Reltio or in Salesforce or in HubSpot, things like that. Highly inefficient way, especially when you are looping through a list of values. Always use the batch mode and create those records in batch. Most of the connectors provide those batch actions for you to utilize that. And you can save a lot of tasks by a factor of the batch size. If you're having a batch size of 2000, if you had processed one at a time, you would have consumed 2000 tasks. But if you do a batch and send like all 2000 in batch, you are just consuming one task. So you're bringing down the task consumption. Last, before I stop for the questions, is use scripts. Within our IH, we provide multiple ways of building scripts. So you can use JavaScript, which is what I use. There's Python, there's Ruby, which whatever your preference is, you can use those scripts for complex transformations, for bulk parsing. And as you saw in the earlier case, wherein we were parsing the data from the geo, we used the Python script the Ruby script as well as the JavaScript. In this case, there's a complex transformation that I'm performing, and I'll come to this use case as well. The transformation here is normalizing the email addresses, or if you have additional use cases of normalizing phone numbers, utilizing some of these JavaScript or Python script improves the performance as well as your task utilization. If you have knack of doing some programming, highly recommended to use these scripts. And this is obvious, but we have seen customers, partners building recipes in which they have defined the variables in multiple steps, right? Which is a big no. Unnecessarily wastes tasks. There is a preferred or a better way to define all the variables in just one step, and then you just uses that one task for all your declarations. For here, if you have 10 variables to be utilized, you have consumed 10 tasks unnecessarily. Yeah. Small things, but helps when you look at the larger picture. I'll stop over here before I talk about some examples.
Yeah, a couple questions. And by the way, like tips and tricks. I love that, Gaurav, and we'll definitely maybe write a blog about that. People can see it. Quickly, I might have missed this, but is there a way to see the number of tasks per task step in the recipe to help better identify where or how to optimize? Maybe you talked about that.
So here's an example, the same recipe that we've been talking about, reading the data from the queue in Reltio and processing that, pushing that data into Reltio, right? So this recipe consumed overall 9 tasks, right? And at every step, if you go, you can look at what was the input, what was the output, and things like that. Right? For example, in this case, you can already see these steps were successfully executed. And if I go over here, it tells me that it was a batch size of 200, and there were like 14 was the size. So this would have executed 1483 divided by 200 times. Right? So whatever it is, 7 or 8, right? So this would have consumed 8 tasks and then plus 1 step for this one, right? So every step typically has 1 task to be consumed, not more than that. It's only the number of times that you execute that step will basically calculate how many tasks are consumed within the recipe. So in this case, since the step was executed 9 times or 8 times, we know that this was 8 plus 1 9. Make sense?
I think so. So what's going to happen if one or a few messages are failed to load in like Salesforce with the batch size of 200? How will we know which needs to be reprocessed?
Very good question. Can I then take a segue into the recipe that I was going to show as an example to have that exact piece answered in the other recipe? Right.
Before you do, can you answer this one question? Just quickly. Are users charged by number of jobs, tasks, and not by time of their execution?
So they are charged based on the tasks, right? So our entitlements or the licenses that we provide for Reltio Integration Hub is solely based on the tasks that you consume out of your entitlements.
Thank you.
And the entitlements that you get, I would prefer that you talk to your account executive or your CSM to know exactly how many tasks are you are entitled for, because it depends on what version of the licensing you are on. Talk to your account executive or CSM to get the exact number of tasks that you can consume on a monthly basis.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any other question before I jump to
That's it. Nope.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take an example of a very common example wherein you are loading data from an S3 or from any cloud storage. Right? Here's this sample file, which is nothing but data for contact person. Right? It has first name, last name, rest of the other attributes along with address. The problem with this file is if you look at column E, it's called programmatic business address. So it has multiple addresses over there. Same is the case with mobile numbers. Same is the case with direct numbers, personal phone numbers, right? So this becomes a highly complex file to be processed because I don't have one value for mobile number or direct number. I have to process and transform that data for that one column into a list of values and then use that list of values as part of the nested value when the record gets created. Right? It's a complex transformation, and we've seen this for a lot of processing. The other piece is this was an extremely large file. It was 1 GB data that we had to process. Right? This was just one file. Basically, we had several similar files and with such complex transformation. Right? So what we did was we used something called as the Vocato SQL transformation. Right? So that's, or rather, Vocato file storage, I should say. It's the same connector. What it does is, so in this recipe, we download that entire file in its storage, right? And then we basically do some calculations so that we can process the data in batches, right? So what we do, let me jump onto the recipes execution itself. So what we do over here is we declare certain variables. The offset, the count is basically the batch size. We're going to define the total records in the file, which gets calculated in step 6, right? And then once in step 7, I get that there were, in this case, 25,000 records, but the actual recipe that we executed had more than 1.5 million records, right? Including that the complex transformation there. And then we define the number of pages based on the batch size, which was 1,000 in this case. And then we run this recipe or in a loop with the batch size and then doing some sort of a pagination and calling this function called function load individuals. The reason we did this was there are certain guardrails in the platform. One of the guardrails is that if your recipe is running for more than 90 minutes, it will stop. So to avoid that 90 minutes timeout, we had these long-running actions, or rather long-running recipes, I should say, which would divide this data, the huge volume of 1.5 million data, into smaller sizes and then call subsequent recipes, which is this call function does. There's also a recipe that is being called from within this row. And we have a higher frequency over here. So for example, 5 recipes will get started at a time. So this kind of a recipe, if you're building or using, it will run for hours. It will not stop within that 90 minutes of guardrail. And then this individual recipe, the call function, processes that batch of 1,000 records, pushes that data into Reltio. Because here we are reading the data from a file. We were creating those records in a batch size of 1,000. And what I've done is I've launched the job which was executed for this particular step. And this is where I will show how the transformation was done. So here there was a question on if there is a batch, just certain records that get failed. So this is where we handle that. So we create this empty list called the response list, and we will fill in this response list with the results of the batch, basically, right? What's happening over here is now we are processing those records in a batch of 10,000. We create those records in Reltio, right? And you can make this even more efficient. I'm not saying that this is the best way of defining these recipes. And once this definition creation is done, we add the response to this list that we created, right? So there were 992 records that get added, and I'll show the response. And then we normalize that data. Well, in this case, we normalized there was nothing. In this case, actually there was nothing, right? But this JavaScript would normalize that data for the email, the mobile number, the direct number, and then finally, what we would do is log those messages. In this case, what I've done over here is, if you see the response list that was there blank, this has those values. I've noted what was the source, what was the crosswalk value. If it was a successful, then what was the URI? And if it successful was failed, then what was the error? So this is how you can track if the records were successfully created within a batch, or if it was a failure, then what was the reason for that failure, along with the specific record that got failed. So hopefully that kind of answers your question, but I can quickly show that simple transformation logic that was of interest, which was, this is where we are adding the response of that batch creation, and we capture the source crosswalk, the URI, if it was a crosswalk value, whether it was successful or a failure, and the error message if it was that. Right? And the other piece that I want to show quickly is we are adding this to the logs. Well, so this was also something that we recently did to send to Avocado logs. And when you do that, you'll be able to see those in one place in the same log as well. Here's that same logic that we saw, right? So this is getting created based on the logs that you are creating over there, right? So if I have an example somewhere, I don't have an example with an error, the error messages that are getting logged can also be seen in this consolidated view. So hopefully you got a fair idea as to what that recipe does, right? And if you're interested in looking at all these recipes, those are already available in our community library. So you can go to the community library, search for Reltio, and you'll get that list of those recipes. So here's that recipe of the high volume streaming SQS, the optimized version that I showed, the recipe that I just showed which uses the Avocado file storage is also available for you to. So you can just go over here, click on this, and then you'll get this button called use this recipe. If you click on this, it will be available on your projects as well. And then you can make it your own and do whatever you want with these recipes.
Great. Just two more questions and then we'll be time to go. So batch size limit is 2,000 on one of your demo things. Why are we using 1,000? Wondering what's the logic behind that decision?
To be on the safer side, sometimes it might happen that the batch size is 2,000 is okay, but if you have a large volume of data, the API might still time out, right? The API also has its limit, and even if the number of records is low, but the size of those records too high, it still might get timed out, right? So just to be on the safer side, I used 1,000 because I know my record size might get increased because I was creating those nested attributes out of mobile number and the other multi-value attributes that I had.
It is writing to the Ricardo log. Would that be counted as a task?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And what's the API limit to what you were just talking about?
Depends on core system. I think for Reltio, it's 180 seconds or something like that. I might have to check and get back, but if I'm not wrong, it's 180 seconds.
Okay. All right. That's all we have time for because we hit the hour exactly. So thank you everyone very much. And I know it looks like some more questions are coming in. If you could post that to community.reltio.com, I'll make sure that Gaurav answers any of those questions that you have. So those 2 or 3 came in. Please take the survey at the end. I'm looking at putting a whole list of things that you say to cover for the rest of the year for shows. And then this PowerPoint and this entire show it's recorded and we'll push it out to community. I'll make sure to give everyone the information by tomorrow, the next day for sure. So thank you, Gaurav. Thank you everyone for spending some time with us again. And until next time, which is, Wednesday, maybe, if you want to come to the patient one. So thanks, Gaurav.